To be here today, and you can hear me, can you? Because I didn't have the mic a second ago. Great. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the community's role in both preventing childhood trauma and then healing from its aftermath. So I'm going to look at the issue from a kind of life course trajectory point of view, because everything is connected. Andrew gave a nice introduction there that I need to cut big time. It was endless. But basically, we haven't joined the dots. We invest a lot of money in picking up the pieces, once damage has been caused. And it's not very efficient use of money. So there's a moral argument as to why we need to care more about moms and babies and families and support healthy attachment. And there's also an economic argument why we need to do that. But there's equally a moral and economic argument as to why we need to be kinder and more compassionate to people who have been harmed, who have developed maladaptive coping strategies like drug and alcohol misuse, who've committed crimes and done harm to others. We need to be kinder and more compassionate to them because, as Karen Treisman, who is a developmental psychologist, says, relational rupture requires relational repair. We need to be loved, we need to be cared for, and if we don't get that when we're young, it has a very big impact on us and our healthy development. In other words, we don't have healthy development. We might have been born perfect, but literally the absence of love and care, the absence of nurturance, poverty, homelessness, poor housing, lack of opportunity. If you grow up in a community where you can't be anybody in the world, that is harmful. So, okay, if you move on to the next one, please. This is a slide from the Beacon House, and it's basically showing how brains develop from the bottom up. There's been a big blossoming of neuroscience evidence, and this applies to all of us, okay? This is not poor people or people from one cultural background or another. We are all essentially the same in terms of what we need to thrive and flourish. And we will all be at risk of health outcomes, relational difficulties, and social and behavioral problems if our needs aren't met. So the first part is the primitive brain that develops, and it's to do with physiological responses, sleeping, temperature, food. We need food to survive. So it's the survival brain. The second part is the limbic brain, the attachment and emotional development system. And the third part, the cortical brain, comes last. That's what separates us from other animals, the thinking brain. So we overestimate, in fact, how rational we are. A lot of our responses are primitive and emotional responses. And a lot of the problematic behaviors that we encounter if we're working with difficult groups are based in the primitive and limbic brain. So what happens if you're frightened is the cortical brain, the thinking brain, goes offline. And that's something to bear in mind, because when you're dealing with people, you can do a lovely cognitive behavioral training program with people in prison when they're safe and have their bed, their 3 meals, and they can think and they can have insight. But then in the moment when they're frightened on release, or being released into homelessness with 20 euro in their pocket, the rational brain goes offline. And what do? They revert oftentimes to old coping strategies, and then the fistful of benzos becomes a really, really good idea to soothe the dysregulated stress response system. This is a picture of the Angry Baby Monument in Norway by Vigeland. I think it's a brilliant metaphor for what happens with a lot of men in prison. They essentially stay, and I mean no disrespect when I say there's a lot of angry babies in our prisons. And what I mean by that is people haven't had the safety or had their emotional needs met or their basic physiological needs met often. And so they've never had healthy co-regulation with an emotionally stable adult, so they haven't learned how to manage their emotions. And 90% of prisoners, Perry and his associates estimate, have a trauma history. Now, how trauma-informed and responsive do we believe our systems are? I think remarkably, appallingly, un-trauma-informed and responsive. Next slide, please. So This is just an example of some of the work I've been doing. Because I'm doing a PhD, I'm lucky I have a bit of flexibility with my employer, and I've used some of my time to raise awareness of the connection between what we do or do not do in infancy and to support mothers or whoever the primary carers of young children are, and the impact that we then have later on when we have serious mental health problems, suicidal epidemics, massive use of drugs and alcohol to survive. Next slide, please. This, I think, is a very useful slide from Ellis and Dietz, which shows how the adverse childhood experiences from the 1998 Felitti and Anda study, you can look it up if you're interested, they identify things like maternal depression, emotional and sexual abuse, substance abuse, domestic violence, homelessness, incarceration, mental illness, divorce, physical and emotional neglect. They were all shown that if you had 4 or more of those happen, you were at risk of far greater health problems like developing cancer, ischemic heart disease, as well as relational problems, higher divorce rates, earlier engagement in sexual behaviours, teen pregnancies were all linked to this. Smoking was linked to having 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences. And that study was done with white, middle-class, college-educated people. And they found that ACEs are very common. 64%, I think, had 1, and 14% had 4 or more. Now, they've done this study elsewhere with different groups, and the dose response holds. So the more of these adverse experiences you have, the greater the risk of developing health problems, and relational problems, and drug and alcohol abuse, and the like, and engaging in violent behaviour. Importantly, Ellis and Dietz have brought the community dimension into this as well. Because when you add things like poverty, discrimination, homelessness, or just very poor quality housing into the mix, lack of opportunity, lack of jobs, there's no meaning in life, as Karen was talking about earlier, that the chronic hopelessness that can beset some communities, and violence and community disruption. Well, then the cumulative toll on certain people is massive altogether. Next slide, please. So I'm a big fan of Maslow because it is just so simple. If we do not have our basic needs met, so for food, shelter, having safety, having a bed, a safe bed in a safe place. If we don't have enough money, so we heard about the hoops that people have to go through to get their disability benefit and how the state is trying to slice them off at the knees. Well, can we be surprised then when people erupt in anger or rage or frustration? It's very normal, because what is happening is they're in their survival brain then. It's like, I need this, and you are not giving me what I need. I am not safe here. And when we're not safe, we're not rational. We don't respond well. We're bubbling volcanoes of emotions. And it's important that services know what's happening here and that we can make it better or worse. We can just say, well, I'm doing what the computer says no, but we can still be kind in delivering that message. We don't need to make it worse. And so our prisons are full of people who have never, frankly, had their safety needs met. Love and belongingness, they belong to a family, and the families generally love them to the best of their ability, but because trauma is intergenerational, it passes from one generation to the next. There's a nice phrase about we repeat what we don't repair. And we also repeat what we don't even remember. So, children who grew up in domestic violence households very often will find themselves repeating behaviours. The boys might be violent themselves towards women. The women might find themselves unconsciously reenacting the trauma of their childhood by choosing unsuitable, violent men. And the cycle continues. So what we need to do is try and interrupt the cycle, but we need to understand, as Sean was saying, the wicked problem. And the wicked problem, I suggest, is trauma. Next slide, please. So yeah, an overdose of ACEs. People will say is trauma and ACEs the same thing. There's widespread disagreement about this. What ACEs is very useful for is it's a simple way to open a conversation. It's really useful for dealing with government or social services to say, we are wasting bucket loads of money and we are actually making things worse for people. We are not dealing with the problem. We are not treating people as humans. We're not seeing the children behind the difficult behaviours in classroom. We're excluding them. We are not supporting mothers who are struggling with their own unresolved trauma. Addictions are very understandable if you've 8 or 9 or 10 ACEs. I mean, really, think about it. If you had that level of personal trauma, do you think you wouldn't use drugs and alcohol to survive? Or do you think you might not develop a mental illness? So we need to understand that even things like neglect, pure neglect, and this is why early intervention and supporting mothers in the very first few months of life can be crucial. Because things like maternal depression is very common, and not just in poorer communities. You know, becoming a mother is difficult, and we are also triggered in our own attachment styles. So if we didn't see warm, nurturant care around us, then we don't know that that's what babies need. So things like health visitor schemes, especially involving people from the community, you know, so it's not necessarily someone from a different class telling you what you're doing wrong. What we need is a strengths-based focus, because anyone's mother is the best asset that they could possibly have. You know, they don't always know that. They don't have the tools. But Neufeld and Gabor Mate would very much say that you have to support the alpha instincts in parents, which are our natural, protective, nurturing instincts. And so if you go into people's households and are judgmental or telling them you're doing everything wrong, you're not breastfeeding properly, just give the child a bottle, that's very undermining of good efforts to be nurturing and caring. But the key point is the dysregulation that an overdose of trauma or ACEs or toxic stress has for a child, and what it does to their system and to their brains and bodies, and how this can bring them into big trouble with the guards, social services, housing authorities, as we've heard. Next slide, please. Is it not working? Okay, thanks. These are just a couple of quotes. One from William Kennedy, which I like because it shows that no one is an alcoholic or a drug addict or a prostitute by nature. Something has had to happen along the way. We all begin as babies. People with infinite potential, but we are all so vulnerable, and if we don't get what we need, essentially love and nurturance and serve and return interactions with our primary carer, we also need to be fed. We need to live in houses that are warm enough that we can concentrate on our homework, because if you're in survival mode, nothing else matters, really. You just need to survive. You're not thinking about your times tables or anything else for that matter. This one then is Bessel van der Kolk, a really exciting psychiatrist and trauma specialist. The key message is that everything again is connected, so you can't disconnect politics from trauma, because our political decisions, our policy decisions exacerbate trauma. And certain communities, again, have higher dosages of trauma than others. Trauma breeds further trauma, hurt people hurt other people. The next slide, please. So this is an article that I wrote about how we need to start asking people what happened to them. You know, instead of treating people as if they're somehow very different to the rest of us, you know, because they've breached people's rights. Well, their rights were breached as children and young people, and we failed to respond in appropriate ways. So it flips, it's the trauma-informed lens from Joe Federaro, that you don't say what's wrong with you, go to what happened to you. And there's now, again, a kind of backlash even to trauma-informed care, that's not even enough. We need to now say what's wrong with you. And that's the strengths-based approach, or healing-centered engagement. Sean Ginwright says, we need to be culturally sensitive. So if you're working with African-American populations, you need to be respectful to the cultural values and ways of being, or if it's traveller people. Then your services, the way you try and engage with people, has to respect their culture and background. It has to be gender responsive. But this is about basic human biology, and some people don't like this because they think it's biological determinism. It's not really, because what it's saying is that it's the environment that changes people. It's the combination of the trauma plus the traumatic community environments and the lack of opportunities that causes the damage. But each and every one of us, I'm lucky, I don't provide any service, so it's easy for me to say, you know, I'm not going to be confronted with the challenging behaviours. And yet I do know that in every interaction that I have the capacity to be a positive addition to someone's day or a negative one. And since learning about this, I find that people, especially survivors, find the ACEs language and science remarkably useful for understanding themselves better and for developing a bit of self-compassion and going, you know what, that's so interesting. So the reason I use drugs and alcohol is because of all these things. I'm not fundamentally a bad person. I've stolen from others. I've ended up in prison because all of these things had a cumulative impact on me and I was unsupported. So it's a really useful way for reframing things for people and for developing a relationship that can be positive going forward. Next slide, please. How much time do I have? Should I be finishing up? Yes. Okay. So there are ACEs missing from the original studies. So things like bullying are very important. Because again, why are they important? It's because of what it does to your stress response system. Things like racism. It's not okay to be racist. Who knew? But it actually changes how people's bodies feel. And it's really not hard to understand that if you're dealing constantly with abuse because of who you are, the same with gender orientation. If you can't be who you are, or if you're being attacked because of who you are, that has a very negative impact on your system. And so what we need to think about, because I need to finish up, in terms of the community context, is we need to see, can we be any bit of a buffer to people at various times in their life? So small children, either in the early years context or in school. As a teacher, what can I do to make that child's life a little bit easier? Can I connect with them? Can I see them underneath the kicking the table over, the screaming, the hostility? You know, because that behaviour is a form of communication. And wouldn't it be nice if that child didn't develop a real loathing of school, because we are further compounding their self-perception of worthlessness? What if we met them with love instead? And that's the overarching message from the ACE Aware Nation movement in Scotland that does get mocked from time to time. Opponents will say, oh, what a pile of nonsense, being kind and compassionate. The systems are the way they are. They're flawed, and system change takes time. But each of us, in all of our interactions, can choose to either respond and ratchet up the tension levels or exclude people from services. Or we can get further training on understanding trauma and just check ourselves and our automatic responses and what our own triggers. And you know, we do all have them because trauma is common. So if we've been emotionally abused in childhood ourselves, we're not going to respond well to people hurling a mouthful of abuse at us. On the other hand, if you know this is actually not about me at all, this is because this person is frightened and is just acting out because that's what they've learned to do in their environment. Or the opposite, the kind of hypo-arousal where people have learned to freeze, you know, to dissociate from their pain. And that can manifest in just not turning up for appointments. If you understand these behaviours, then you can hopefully understand that you are potentially a tool in helping the person to learn to regulate in time, depending on what you do. But even public services like housing officials or social welfare, or people who are making decisions, it would be a good idea to train them all in trauma and what it does to people, so that diffuse certain tense situations. I leave it there. I only got through about 3 slides as usual, so they can be shared with anyone who wants them. Thanks so much.